Cathy Minehan. Cathy Minehan. I want to welcome you here to the third semester of the open classroom. That's much better, isn't it? For those of you who have been with us all 3 semesters, we started out a year ago on a nicer day, looking at the 21st century city, challenges and opportunities. And last semester, you'll recall, for those of you who were with us, we looked at policy advice to the next president. And we began that, of course, in September, well before we knew who that would be. And we ended it up on December 15th, as you remember, with David Gergen and Michael Dukakis and Bob Culver, talking about now what's up, how do we govern? And we're about ready to see that in 13 days. But this semester, Cathy Minehan and I have put together a course that I think is going to break all kinds of records. Because we're going to be looking at the economy when the American economy and the global economy is in probably more turmoil than perhaps any time since the 1930s. In fact, tonight you'll see some slides of the latest forecasts of where the best forecasters think the American economy will be for the rest of this year and perhaps even going into calendar 2010. What we've put together for you is a course, though, that goes back behind the headlines, goes back behind current events, to try and really understand 2 fundamental questions. What contributes to economic growth? And we're even going to ask some questions today about growth for what. But we don't only want to ask questions about what contributes to economic growth, we want to ask some very important questions about the distribution of prosperity. Who gets what shares of that growth, why, and whether in fact we think that distribution might be altered to make it better in some social sense. We're going to be joined, as you'll see in just a few minutes, with some of the finest economists, and in a few cases sociologists and policy makers in the nation, including next week Bob Solow, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, professor of MIT, who is really the dean of growth theory in the world, and one of the most enjoyable lectures you will ever hear. As you'll see, we're going to go through a lot of topics, and we hope you'll be able to join us as many Wednesday evenings as possible between now and April 15th. Interestingly, tax day. So what we're going to do today, and you'll hear more about it, is first of all introduce the whole course, what we're going through, so you can see almost week by week what we're doing. And then also introduce some of the key concepts that we're going to use. We're then going to change slideshows. And we're going to take a look at the whole question of just kind of what are some of the basic economic data we can play with. What are some of the time series? What are some of the trends we've seen? Both going back in some cases to the 1960s, and a few cases just looking at what's happened over the last 7 or 8 years. So without further ado, let's begin, and let's take a look at the U.S. economy in numbers, and let me introduce Cathy Minehan. By the way, for those of you who have not signed up for this class yet, because we were a little late getting the sign up, before you leave today, please sign up your name, give us your email address so we can keep you, current in what we're doing. By the way, you should also, I should mention, go to www.policyschool.neu.edu. That's the website for the School of Social Science, Urban Affairs, and Public Policy, and you'll see that there's a special page for the open classroom, and you'll see that the slideshows down the semester will have different articles. Ultimately, we may even have videos so that you can keep in touch with the classroom virtually as well as real. Cathy Minehan.
Thank you very much, Barry. I too am very much looking forward to this class. As some of you remember, I was part of the student body for the first one of these classes, and I tried to attend as many last semester as I could, so I know how challenging all of you can be with your questions, and I'm looking forward to them. We're going to try and cover a wide range of things in the first part of the class, take a little break, and then give you the opportunity to ask questions in the second part of the class. Now, as... We're on the wrong set of slides.
We are.
I knew this would happen.
There we go.
There we go. Okay. As Barry mentioned, we gather in what the Chinese would refer to as interesting times. Not since the 1930s have we faced such inauspicious economic data. According to the NBER, the recession that we're in right now is already a year and almost a month old. That's already longer than the two previous recessions in the last 15, 20 years, the one in 1991 and the one in 2001. We have to go back to the early 70s to get a recession that looks like it's about the same length as the one we're in right now, and we're not out of it yet. In many ways, this recession has got to be thought of as inevitable. The proximate cause was a decline in the fundamentals of the housing market starting in 2005, when house price growth outstripped both demographic and income growth. When that outstripping occurred in the latter parts of 2005, normal demand waned, and mortgage originators reached for new borrowers, created new demand, new products, and the subprime, the real guts of the subprime craze took off. In late 05, 06, and early 07, seeing the worst of the situation in terms of subprime, really questionable subprime lending. But frankly, that's only the straw that broke the camel's back. Where we were in 05, 06, 07, things were so overdone that something almost had to happen, whether it was as a result of subprime lending, mortgage markets in general, sophisticated financial instruments. It could have been any number of things that was the spark that led to the fire that's creating the problems we have right now. To quote that famous American philosopher, we have met the enemy and they is us. How were we our own enemy? Well, first of all, the level of indebtedness, both personal and for the U.S. as a whole. The ratio of private debt to GDP rose to about 300%. We used to sit around the open market committee table. I was on the open market committee for 13 years. We'd sit around the open market table, particularly in the wake of the 2000-2001 recession, and talk about the resiliency of the U.S. economy. Resiliency we can now translate into rising debt. People may or may not have been better off, and I think Barry's got some great data that show on a real basis lots of American families weren't better off. But they spent more. They spent more because they could borrow against the value, what they perceived and what was actually the rising value of assets. And they went into debt as a result. And when they spent more and went into debt as a result, the country became more and more indebted. And you saw this in what's called, in a very fairly esoteric way, the current account deficit. That's our balance in terms of borrowing or lending with the rest of the world. In a normal situation, a developing country is a big borrower, and a developed country like the United States is a big lender. Developed countries should have something like a balance or a surplus, and developing countries ought to be borrowing. I mean, the logic of that is sort of obvious. We, however, were running a current account deficit. That means we were borrowing from the rest of the world to the tune of 5, 6, 6.5% of GDP. unheard of, even in very small developing countries without big problems. There were many of us who wrote and talked about the external imbalance that the country was facing, that was mirrored in negative personal savings rates, that was mirrored in high and rising household debt. But we hoped and we assumed that the denouement of that, and it had to end. You know, trees don't grow to the sky, that old maxim, if something can continue, it doesn't, Herb Stein. It had to end at some point, and we thought that because of the size and the power of the U.S. economy, and the fact that the debts that we were running were other countries, in particular China's main growth, form of growth. There's very much export-driven growth on the part of China. That because of that codependency, as Cathy Minehan, who's a professor out at the Heller School, that codependency between us as a borrowing nation and developing countries, in particular China as a lending nation, would keep us from having a severe problem as our indebtedness unwound itself. What had to happen in this way of thinking was our growth had to go down to a lower level than the rest of the world. Our exports had to become more affordable to the rest of the world. They had to generate more domestic demand, and sooner or later our indebtedness would unwind itself. And you could paint a nice picture of all of this stuff unfolding in a very easy fashion. That's not what happened, is it? What has happened is, in the process of becoming very extended, increasing our leverage as a country, increasing our leverage as individuals, increasing our leverage, our borrowing as families, we became very exposed to financial conditions both within our country and the rest of the world. The rest of the world was a big saver to our being a big borrower. This created what Ben Bernanke has called over-savings, what other people have called a liquidity glut. When something becomes when there's a lot of it in a system, the price usually goes down. High degree of liquidity, very low interest rates. Also very low interest rates, prompted by the Federal Reserve, and we could talk a little bit, if you want, later on about what the role of very low interest rates in this current problem was. Because interest rates were very low, risk was mispriced. The spreads between very unrisky assets like treasury bills and very highly risky assets, or what should have been highly, seen as highly risky assets like non-investment grade securities collapsed. So there was very little pricing for risk. In an environment of lots of money all around, high degree of leverage, people were looking for yield. So there's this reaching for yield phenomenon. And at the same time, technological change produced a whole range of new securities that both drew in that liquidity and created an environment in which additional yield was paid and responded to the demand for additional yield in an environment of very low interest rates. So it's a perfect storm. Lots and lots of money all around from the saving nations, very low interest rates, not effective pricing of risk, and untested, less than transparent market products. Great when everything's coming along. But as soon as you start questioning the value of assets in an environment like this, as soon as you start, wherever there's a little chink in the market value of something, people start asking the questions they should have been asking all along. And all of a sudden, values start to plummet, and the trust goes out of the market. Markets work on credit, credit works on trust. You don't have trust, no one will lend you any money. If they don't trust you're going to pay it back. If no one lends you any money, your ability to function in the market ultimately stops. And that's basically what we saw in September, October of this year. Trust went out of the market. Nobody believed the valuations of assets on somebody else's balance sheet because they didn't believe those assets were worth anything. They weren't willing to lend any money against them. Credit's the lifeblood of the economy. Credit's the lifeblood of the financial markets. It stopped flowing. And that's the situation we found ourselves in. And that financial crisis, because credit is the lifeblood of the market, that financial crisis had produced a negative loop into the real economy. So the financial storm moved from credit markets to the real economy, and it's now producing the economic effects that I talked about before, possibly the worst recession in post-war history. And so that's where we are at the end of 2008, with about 1.9 million jobs lost over this year. But that 1.9 million is kind of, in a way, not as clear as it might otherwise be, because it hasn't been consistent. It started off with job losses and dribs and drabs, and those dribs and drabs got bigger and bigger and bigger. And finally in November, with the job loss of 533,000, which if you do the math, that's more like 6 million jobs, a pace of 6 million jobs being lost rather than nearly 2 million. We've been gradually moving ourselves into a very difficult position from the perspective of jobs. The unemployment rate is at 6.7%. However, if you think about the employment rate is composed not just of those people who are officially unemployed, but those people who would like to be working and those people who are working fewer hours than they would otherwise like. You're really talking about an underemployment rate of something like 12% rather than the 6.7. That starts to get your attention. In combination with stock market declines and home price declines, we have the S&P index here off 38%. We have the Dow Jones Wilshire 5000, the loss of market share of about $7 trillion. If you add the losses to household wealth from the loss in home prices, we're talking about a wealth decline over the past year in this economy of something like $11 to $13 trillion. Again, a number that catches your attention.
That would be about equal to the GDP for an entire year.
Yes.
$12 trillion.
Yeah, a little bit bigger. The overall GDP in nominal terms is, 13, 14 trillion. Yeah, that's about it. This is wealth. It's not GDP, is the gross domestic product for a year, the amount of production of goods and services for a year. So you're talking about an annual number versus an accumulated number, but still, it's a number that catches your eye. In response, consumption, which is 70% of GDP, fell by something like 4%. On an annualized basis in the fourth quarter, which is a decline that is one of the worst in post-war history. Why did it fall? It fell because people got scared. They're losing their jobs. They can't get a loan. Everybody around them is losing their jobs. Everybody around them can't get a loan. Every time they pick up the newspaper, the news is worse and worse. So people stopped spending and started either paying down debt or saving. Now that's a very good thing for the long run. I remember, going back 2 or 3 years ago when the personal savings rate was continually negative for months on end. That is, people were spending more than they had. They were not saving at all. In fact, they were drawing down their savings. And, you know, we used to talk at long length, and you would hear people all over the television talking at long length about the decline of personal savings rates in the country and how that was unsustainable. Well, clearly it is unsustainable, and people have figured that out, and they're starting to save now. Very good for the long run, very tough for the short run. Because what you want people to do in a situation like the present one is to spend money and get the economy moving and keep the economy moving. And people are scared right now. Financial market participants are scared. Trust has gone out of markets. They don't know who to lend to. It's not clear to them who's a good risk. That's moved into the real economy. People, families are scared. This is not just us, too. I think the previous slide talked a little bit about this is a global thing, not just a U.S. thing. If you looked at the value lost globally, we're 11 to 13 trillion. A guesstimate at global wealth loss would be about $30 trillion. The best guess of most forecasters right now is that for the first time in post-war history, we will have a worldwide decline in growth in 2009. And because we will have a worldwide decline in growth in 2009, some of the things, you know, our export growth this year, our trade, some of our trade things started to straighten out a little bit this year because our goods started to be a little bit more affordable to the rest of the world. It's not likely that's going to happen in 2009, 2010 to the same degree that it did in 2008, largely because the rest of the world is following us into this recession. Now, taking a look at the oil price here. Not everything is bad. There are some silver linings, and the decline in the oil price is one of them. Not if you're in the oil business. You know, that's not so good. And I have to think, you know, all of these discussions we've had about, you know, why don't big oil companies have CapEx spending? You know, why don't they go out and, you know, explore all of this hard-to-find oil? Why don't they go into alternative energies? Well, look at this. On July 3rd, the oil price was $145.29. On December 31st, it was $44.60. I've heard a lot of people talk about $49, $50 being the minimum price per barrel of oil that you could afford to do some of this higher risk exploration. How do you manage a business that can't, the price of, the income from which is as volatile as this? Not that I'm at all apologizing for the attitude of oil companies here, but you got to wonder how you manage a business and make the kind of expenditures that are necessary to be made in the oil business with this sort of volatility. However, oil price declines act as an increase to disposable personal income for people. The estimate on the effect of the decline in oil prices on gasoline and therefore on personal incomes is something like $250 billion for the U.S. consumer. So, there, you know, it's not every cloud completely dark here. There is a little bit of a silver lining. Another part of the silver lining is people are saving. Bad for the short run, good for the long run, and when you start looking at the long run the country is facing, and I think Bob Culver and Mike Dukakis talked a little bit about this last semester. I mean, when you think about the deficits that we're going to be running, even if even taking out all of the fiscal stimulus that's in the works now and will be in the works, even if we find some way to, pull that back in, or even if that turns out to be, in some ways producing a lot of growth as well as debt at the national level, we've still got to face Social Security and we've still got to face medical cost trends. And they were already going to be creating a train wreck for our fiscal situation. So people saving is a good thing. Another thing that's a good thing is inflation is definitely not an issue anymore. 5 or 6 months ago it was an issue, it's not an issue anymore. You can hear people talk about deflation, but that's a subject for a whole different talk. But the fact that inflation isn't an issue anymore gives, I think, policy a little bit more flexibility. So that takes us to policy. Now this, banks owning, U.S. banks, the U.S. owning stock in banks, of 206, switching this wording around here. I think we're saying here that the United States has put cash into 206 banks, and that's of course part of the fiscal stimulus under the TARP. Between the efforts of the Fed and the efforts of the U.S. Treasury under the TARP program, this is one of the most unprecedented aspects of the time that we're in. If you look at the Depression, if you look at any economic downturn after the Depression, up until the present time, I think you would be hard put to find any form of monetary or fiscal stimulus that takes the shape, that's as innovative, that's as dramatic as what's been done in the United States over the last year or so. In part by the Federal Reserve, with 11 or 12 different facilities trying to find ways to buy up some of the securities that are causing trouble in the markets and getting credit to flow in an easier fashion. The Fed balance sheet, if you look at the assets on the Fed balance sheet, you get an idea of the magnitude of the amount of money that the Fed has already pumped into the system to keep it afloat. A year or so ago, the Fed balance sheet was looking like $800 to $900 billion. Right now, it's about $2.3 to $2.4 trillion. So $1.5 trillion have been put into the market to keep it afloat, to keep credit flowing at least a little bit within our economy, to keep the economy moving along in a better fashion. Then there's the $700 billion TARP from which we got the money to invest in 206 banks. Again, I say that's truly unprecedented. We have never seen fiscal stimulus like this before. Hopefully we will never see it again. Hopefully when we get out of this, we will have figured out a way to better organize and better supervise our financial system. And I think another part of the silver lining is that our new administration is really focused both on more stimulus and on reform to the financial system going forward. There's going to be a lot of debate about the shape and how that gets done, and it'll be a very interesting and fascinating debate, and I think this course is going to help all of you think in new ways about where you ought to be on the spectrum of discussion in that debate. Okay. However, that's yet to happen. Each day now is bringing grimmer and grimmer news. There's been a sharp pullback in manufacturing. Durable goods orders earlier this week were pretty negative. Anything you see on housing, sometimes you think it's hitting a bottom, sometimes you think it's, still got some way to go. Only 40% of Americans think that Americans' best days are in the future. It's funny, that number never really gets much above 60, does it? It's low now, but
That's the lowest ever reported in that survey.
yeah.
Since 1951.
Yeah, that 40% is the lowest in this particular survey. And consumer confidence itself is at the lowest level. I guess we're talking about the same thing here. This would be Michigan? Yeah, it's the Michigan survey since the early 1950s. And there are many other measures of the economy that are at their lowest points. Measures of manufacturing, measures of capacity utilization, measures of sentiment, measures of confidence. Clearly, the trust that was lost in the markets is negative feedback loop has wended its way into the real economy and hit the consumer as I said before, with a lot of fright.